November 14, 1965, Ia Drang Valley, central highlands of South Vietnam. The sun had barely climbed above the mist-draped canopy when the first reports of gunfire cracked through the still air. Helicopter rotors faded into the distance, leaving behind 450 men of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, alone in a clearing that would soon become a killing ground. First Lieutenant James Riley knelt in the trampled grass, his hands trembling as he wrote in his small, sweat-stained notebook. "The rifle in my hands just saved my life," he scrawled, "but I watched 3 men die today because theirs would not fire. They were part of Lieutenant Colonel Harold Hal Moore's battalion, the first major U.S. ground force to clash head-on with regular North Vietnamese Army troops, elements of the 66th Regiment, only minutes after landing at Landing Zone X-Ray, a 100-yard clearing at the base of the Chu Pong Massif, 14 miles west of Pleiku. The fight that erupted that morning would rage for 3 relentless days. It marked the U.S. Army's first true test against the North Vietnamese in open battle, and the first baptism of fire for a new weapon hailed as the rifle of the future. The M16, lightweight and futuristic, had been rushed into the jungles of Vietnam with bold promises of revolutionary firepower. Some soldiers praised it for its precision and ease of handling. Others watched it fail catastrophically in the midst of combat. None of them yet knew that the M16, the weapon meant to save American lives, would instead ignite one of the greatest crises in U.S. military history, a chain reaction of technical flaws, bureaucratic neglect, and misplaced faith in technology that would cost hundreds of soldiers their lives before Congress was forced to intervene. This disaster did not begin on the battlefields of Vietnam. Its roots were buried deep in the quiet conference rooms of the Pentagon and the polished boardrooms of American defense contractors, where numbers, budgets, and production deadlines mattered more than the muddy realities of war. Before it became a symbol of controversy, the M16 began as a bold experiment, a weapon born from the mind of an engineer who refused to follow convention. In the late 1950s, Eugene Stoner, a former Marine turned machinist and designer, was searching for a better way to build a rifle. His experiences in the Pacific during World War II had shown him the limits of traditional firearms, heavy, wood-stocked, and prone to failure in the elements. Working for Armalite, a small arms division of the Fairchild Engine and Airplane Corporation, Stoner set out to challenge every standard the U.S. military held sacred. What emerged was the AR-15, sleek, light, and made with aircraft-grade aluminum instead of wood and steel. In 1957, when the prototype was demonstrated at Fort Benning, Georgia, military observers were stunned. The rifle weighed barely 6.3 pounds, nearly 3 pounds lighter than the Army's standard-issue M14. It fired a new, smaller 5.56 millimeter cartridge, adapted from the commercial .223 Remington, with a velocity exceeding 3,000 feet per second. Early tests with Special Forces units in the early 1960s delivered astonishing results. The weapon's minimal recoil allowed accurate bursts even in full automatic fire. Soldiers could carry nearly 300 rounds for the same weight as 180 rounds of 7.62 millimeter ammunition. And at close range, the high-velocity bullet's wounding power was devastating, perfectly suited to the jungle warfare that was escalating in Southeast Asia. The U.S. Air Force's security forces adopted the rifle first and praised its performance. Reports described it as light, accurate, and highly reliable. For a brief moment, it seemed America had found its next great infantry weapon. But between the AR-15's promising debut and the rifle that would reach the jungles of Vietnam, a series of quiet decisions inside the Pentagon would change everything. In January 1963, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara ordered an end to M14 production, convinced by his analysts that Stoner's rifle was superior. That November, he authorized the purchase of 85,000 rifles, now redesignated as the XM16E1, overruling objections from traditional Army officers still loyal to the M14. Production began in March 1964, driven by 3 priorities: lower cost, faster output, and suitability for Vietnam's harsh terrain. Yet the weapon McNamara approved was not the rifle Stoner had built. Its internal chemistry, literally the explosive heart of the gun, was about to be altered. Stoner's design had been engineered around a specific DuPont powder, IMR 4475, a clean-burning propellant that produced predictable pressure and an ideal firing rate of about 800 rounds per minute. But when DuPont warned the Army it couldn't mass-produce that powder at scale, officials turned to an alternative, WC-846, a ball propellant manufactured by Olin Matheson Chemical Corporation. Ball powder was easier and cheaper to make. Batches could be produced in less than 2 days compared to 2 weeks for Stoner's preferred stick powder. It met the Army's urgency for ammunition by the millions. But there was a catch. WC-846 burned hotter and longer, generating higher pressures that forced more gas and residue back into the weapon's delicate inner workings. It was also laced with calcium carbonate, a stabilizing compound that left behind thick carbon fouling. In most rifles, gas was vented through a piston, away from critical components. But Stoner's design used direct gas impingement, sending hot gas straight into the bolt carrier to cycle the action. With each shot, microscopic residue from the new powder was blown directly into the rifle's heart. The Army approved the change without retesting the rifle under these new conditions. Ammunition tests continued with old DuPont powder, even as shipments of WC-846 loaded rounds were packed for Vietnam. It was a decision that would haunt the U.S. military for years to come, and it wasn't the only one. Engineers had given clear advice. Practitioners ignored it. Stoner and the Armalite designers had not built the AR-15 around wishful thinking. They engineered it as a complete system. Rifle, ammunition, materials, and maintenance all tuned to work together. One early recommendation was simple and proven: chrome plate the chamber and bore. Chrome was not a novelty. It had protected artillery barrels and aircraft guns for decades. A thin chromium layer resists corrosion, reduces friction, and prevents spent cartridge cases from welding themselves to hot steel, a real advantage in the steaming humidity of Southeast Asia. But chrome cost money and slowed production. Traditionalists in Army ordnance also raised an old claim that chrome could hurt accuracy, and the decision-makers, pressed for speed and savings, declined the plating. The rifles went to war with bare steel chambers that would quickly succumb to tropical corrosion. Another error was cultural. Marketing and wishful engineering birthed the self-cleaning myth. Early propaganda and some briefings described the M16 as needing almost no maintenance, a light, low-care rifle that would spare soldiers the tedium of constant cleaning. This message traveled down the supply chain and into campaign preparations. Cleaning kits were in short supply, field instructions were sparse, and many troops were told the gun required little or no routine care. That complacency collided with the reality of WC-846 ball powder. Unlike the clean-burning stick powder the rifle was designed for, WC-846 produced stubborn fouling, sticky residue that accumulated with each shot. Because Stoner's design used direct gas impingement, that fouling was blown straight into the bolt carrier, and chamber. Without chrome lining and without routine cleaning, tiny deposits built up until extraction became impossible. A smaller mechanical tweak added to the tragedy: the forward assist. Stoner had deliberately left this device off his original AR-15, arguing that if a bolt wouldn't close, forcing it would risk catastrophic malfunctions, and that soldiers should clear the cause properly. Army ordnance disagreed and ordered a forward assist added so troops could shove a reluctant bolt home under pressure. In the field, that tool became a double-edged sword. Soldiers used it to force rounds into a fouled chamber, sometimes making jams worse instead of solving them. The forward assist would later be both criticized and strengthened, but by the time its consequences were known, lives had been lost. Finally, quality control problems crept in as production ramped. Acceptance tests continued to use ammunition the M16 had been designed around, while millions of rounds loaded with the new ball powder were shipped to Vietnam. Colt and other manufacturers raised concerns that the new propellant altered the rifle's cyclic rate and increased wear, but their warnings were downplayed or overridden. Rifles left factories with extractors, springs, or bolt carriers that would not hold up under the harsher, fouling-heavy conditions they'd face in combat. Small design choices, budgetary shortcuts, and marketing slogans, each on its own seemed manageable. Together, they created a perfect storm, a precision weapon, engineered for one set of conditions, forced to operate with different ammunition, without its recommended corrosion protection, and without the cleaning culture needed to keep it functioning. When the M16 first entered combat, it did so in the hands of America's elite. In early 1965, the first shipments reached Vietnam, issued to Special Forces, airborne units, and the newly formed 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile. These men were among the best trained soldiers in the U.S. Army, disciplined, attentive, and accustomed to maintaining their gear meticulously. Their early experiences would shape the rifle's reputation, for better and worse. When Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore led his 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry into Landing Zone X-Ray that November, they carried those new M16 rifles. The battlefield, a 100-yard clearing at the base of the Chu Pong Massif near the Cambodian border, was surrounded by thick elephant grass and dense jungle. Within 15 minutes of the first helicopter touching down, Moore's men were under direct assault from 3 regiments of the North Vietnamese Army, roughly 2,000 soldiers. The battle that followed, 3 days of relentless combat, would become one of the most studied engagements of the Vietnam War. Fighting was often so close that bayonets, grenades, and fists replaced rifles. Soldiers fired their M16 until barrels steamed. In that crucible, the rifle seemed to justify every promise made by its designers. Lightweight and controllable, the M16 allowed soldiers to carry nearly 400 rounds apiece compared to the 180 they might have managed with heavier M14 rifles. Many men fired on full automatic, laying down walls of bullets that shredded charging NVA formations. Combined with artillery and airstrikes, that firepower kept the perimeter from collapsing. Sergeant Ernie Savage, who commanded a small perimeter cut off from the rest of his company, later recalled, "I never ran out of ammo. I had about 30 magazines in my pack, and my M16 never failed." For many soldiers at Ia Drang, the weapon performed flawlessly, fast, light, deadly. The battle's outcome seemed proof that the new rifle was a triumph of modern engineering, but the success at Ia Drang hid a fatal truth. The M16S used were new, their chambers clean and unworn, and they were fed with DuPont 1MR 4475 powder, the very propellant the weapon had been designed to use. The men who carried them were better trained and more meticulous about maintenance than the average infantryman who would arrive later. As 1966 began and the rifle was issued to regular line units, those protective factors disappeared. The ammunition changed, the rifles aged, and the troops were told their new weapons needed little cleaning. The early glow of success would soon give way to something far darker, a wave of failures that turned the M16 from a symbol of innovation into a soldier's nightmare. By mid-1966, the illusion shattered. Letters began trickling home from Vietnam, desperate, angry letters from soldiers who said their rifles were failing when they needed them most. What had once been hailed as the rifle of the future was now being cursed as a death sentence. As the M16 replaced older weapons across the Army and Marine Corps, the problems multiplied. The ammunition now issued was loaded exclusively with WC-846 ball powder, the same propellant that burned dirtier and hotter than Stoner's original design could handle. Rifles were shipped without chrome plating and with little instruction beyond a single line, minimal maintenance required. Men went into combat believing their weapons were nearly self-cleaning. They would learn otherwise, too late. Reports described firefights where the M16 jammed after just a few bursts. The same pattern repeated over and over again. A soldier would fire a dozen rounds. The gun would suddenly seize, and the bolt would lock forward, frozen solid. The culprit was always the same, a spent cartridge case stuck in the chamber. Here's how it happened. Fouling from the calcium-laced ball powder built up in the unplated chamber until a fired case welded itself to the rough steel walls. When the bolt tried to extract it, the extractor claw tore through the soft brass rim, leaving the body of the case wedged tight. The next round would ram into the obstruction, locking the weapon completely. The hammer would drop with a hollow click, the firing pin unable to reach its target. Clearing that kind of jam required a cleaning rod, a tool most soldiers didn't have. It meant ramming a rod down the barrel and punching the stuck casing out from the muzzle end, a task that could take half a minute, even for a trained man. In a firefight at point-blank range, 30 seconds was an eternity. In the words of Marine Corporal John Stevens, writing home in June 1966, "Out of 40 rounds I fired, my rifle jammed about 10 times. I pack as many grenades as I can, plus a bayonet and my K-bar knife, so I'll have something to fight with. If you can, please send me a bore rod and a paintbrush. I need it. Our rifles are getting guys killed." The tone of these letters carried more than frustration. It was fear. Soldiers no longer trusted the weapon that was supposed to protect them. Some units began scavenging AK-47s from dead North Vietnamese soldiers, weapons they knew would fire no matter how filthy, wet, or rusted they were. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. The Soviet-designed AK-47, with its gas piston system and loose mechanical tolerances, could be dragged through a rice paddy, buried in mud, and still work perfectly. The M16, with its tighter tolerances and gas vented directly into its own mechanism, choked on the jungle's humidity and its own residue. Sergeant William Rodriguez, who served in the Central Highlands, summed it up bitterly. We picked up AKs that had been buried in mud, dropped in rivers, left out for weeks. We pulled the bolt back, and they fired. Our M16 jammed if you looked at them wrong. Unofficially, many squad leaders began allowing, even encouraging, men to carry captured AKs. The Army forbade it, but the troops didn't care. To them, a functioning enemy rifle was worth more than a defective American one. By late 1966, entire battalions were losing men, not because they were outgunned, but because their rifles had simply stopped working. A report from the 1st Infantry Division recorded that so many new XM16E1s were jamming that confidence has been degraded. The weapon had become an object of fear, one that soldiers would clean obsessively if they could, or abandon if they couldn't. And all the while, the bureaucracy responsible for the disaster insisted that the problems were exaggerated or the soldiers at fault. But the truth was spreading, through letters, casualty reports, and battlefield whispers. The rifle that had been sold as a triumph of modern engineering was failing in the mud of Vietnam, and as word reached the United States, what began as a technical flaw was about to explode into a national scandal. By late 1966, the U.S. command in Vietnam could no longer pretend the problem didn't exist. Reports of rifles locking up mid-battle were flooding in from the field, backed by casualty lists that told a brutal story. Men were dying not from lack of courage or tactics, but from weapons that wouldn't fire. General William Westmoreland, commander of all U.S. forces in Vietnam, found himself trapped between loyalty and truth. Just a year earlier, he had personally requested 100,000 M16 rifles, convinced it was the perfect rifle for jungle warfare. He had visited Ia Drang and heard glowing reviews from soldiers who had used the rifle in that first major test. But now, his inbox was full of grim after-action reports and soldier letters describing the opposite: catastrophic malfunctions, dead friends, and rifles they no longer trusted. The situation reached a breaking point after the Marine Corps' 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines, conducted a formal survey in December 1966, following heavy combat during Operation Prairie near the demilitarized zone. The results were devastating. Nearly 80% of the Marines surveyed reported that their M16s had malfunctioned in combat. Most said their rifles jammed after firing fewer than 10 rounds. Some reported that the gun locked up after just 3 or 4 shots. Many testified that men had been killed because their weapons failed at the worst possible moment. The most haunting account came from an incident later confirmed by investigators. A young Marine corporal, the only man in his squad who had a cleaning rod, ran from position to position under fire, desperately clearing jammed rifles for his fellow Marines. He was shot and killed while trying to unjam another man's weapon. His own rifle, clean, functional, and loaded, was found lying beside his body. Stories like his tore through the ranks and eventually reached home. Soldiers began writing directly to senators and newspapers pleading for help. One Marine officer wrote to Senator Gaylord Nelson saying, "The weapon has failed us at crucial moments. As many as 60% of the rifles failed to operate. I know of Marines who died within 10 feet of the enemy with jammed rifles." Another wrote more simply, "You know what killed most of us? Our own rifles." The M16. On March 26, 1967, the Washington Daily News published a front-page exposé featuring these letters and interviews with returning veterans. The article hit the American public like a thunderclap. How could the world's most advanced military send its soldiers to war with defective rifles? Who was responsible for this lethal oversight? The outrage reached Capitol Hill within days. Families of dead soldiers demanded answers. Newspapers ran editorials accusing the Pentagon of criminal negligence. Under mounting pressure, Congress acted. On May 3, 1967, Representative L. Mendel Rivers, chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, announced a special investigation into the M16 program. He appointed Representative Richard Ichord of Missouri to lead the subcommittee, joined by Speedy O. Long of Louisiana and William G. Bray of Indiana. The hearings would become one of the most exhaustive weapons investigations in American history. exposing not just the failures of a rifle, but the deeper rot within the system that had sent it into battle unready. Over the following months, hundreds of witnesses, from factory engineers to frontline soldiers, would testify under oath. Their stories would reveal how small oversights, ignored warnings, and bureaucratic arrogance had turned a promising weapon into a tragedy. And as the world soon learned, almost every part of the M16's journey, from the type of powder used to the training soldiers received, had been mishandled. The hearings began in May 1967, inside the Rayburn House office building in Washington, D.C. What started as a weapons inquiry quickly evolved into one of the most damning investigations in U.S. military history. Representative Richard Ichord, a soft-spoken congressman from Missouri, chaired the sessions. Over the course of 3 months, from May to August 1967, his subcommittee summoned generals, engineers, corporate executives, and combat veterans. The goal was simple, yet seismic: uncover exactly how the most advanced army in the world had sent its soldiers to war with a rifle that jammed in battle. The testimony was staggering in scope. Witnesses included men just returned from Vietnam, still shaken from firefights where their rifles had failed. Others were engineers from Colt, officials from Olin Matheson, the powder manufacturer, and even Eugene Stoner himself, the weapon's original designer. Bit by bit, the truth emerged. The committee pieced together a chain of bureaucratic decisions that turned the AR-15, a reliable and revolutionary weapon, into the fatally flawed M16. They discovered that the switch from IMR 4475 stick powder to WC 846 ball powder, made without full-scale testing, had caused catastrophic fouling. Internal reports showed that Army Ordnance had data warning of the powder's higher pressure and residue problems, but approved it anyway to meet ammunition quotas. They found letters from Colt engineers protesting the change, warning that the company could not guarantee reliability with the new propellant. They had even documented that the rifle's cyclic rate, how fast it fired, had jumped from 800 to nearly 1,000 rounds per minute, increasing wear and malfunction risk. The Army's response: they granted Colt a waiver, allowing rifles to ship despite failing specification limits. The investigation also uncovered that chrome plating, recommended repeatedly by both Stoner and Colt, had been rejected solely to save time and money. Army officials claimed chrome would reduce accuracy, even though decades of data from artillery and machine guns proved otherwise. The real reason was cost. Even worse, the Army had fielded the rifle without providing cleaning kits, brushes, or lubricants, and had distributed marketing materials claiming the M16 was self-cleaning. The soldiers, the committee concluded, had been betrayed by misinformation as much as by engineering flaws. The testimony of combat veterans hit Congress hardest. Marine Corporal Thomas Martinez described how his rifle jammed after 3 rounds during an ambush. He fought with his bayonet, was wounded, and watched his fire team leader die beside him, still trying to clear his own rifle. Private First Class David Chen testified about finding a dead American patrol. All 7 men were killed, all 7 M16 jammed. The cleaning rods were lying next to them. Eugene Stoner's own testimony was calm but cutting. He explained that the AR-15 had been designed as a system, rifle, ammunition, and maintenance all balanced together. Changing the propellant or skipping chrome plating, he said, broke the system. He had never once claimed the rifle was self-cleaning. That myth, he added, was a marketing invention. Ballistics experts confirmed that the ball powder's calcium carbonate coating produced heavy fouling. The extra residue combined with unplated chambers to cause cases to seize. And because the rifle fired faster, malfunctions compounded before a soldier could react. By the time the hearings concluded, the committee had drawn an unmistakable picture. This was not a field failure. It was a bureaucratic failure. The Army had ignored engineering warnings, bypassed testing, and prioritized deadlines and savings over soldier safety. While the committee found no evidence of deliberate corruption, it exposed a network of misplaced incentives where production speed and political image outweighed reliability. In October 1967, the Ichord Report was published. Its conclusions were devastating.
The switch to ball powder without testing was the primary cause of the malfunctions. The lack of chrome plating was the secondary cause. The absence of cleaning kits and training was the third. The report called for immediate reforms: chrome plating for all rifle chambers and bores, redesigned ammunition, improved quality control, and comprehensive maintenance training for all troops. For soldiers still in Vietnam, those changes couldn't come soon enough. But the investigation had finally done what field reports, letters, and casualty lists had failed to achieve. It forced the Army to admit there was a problem. And from that admission, the long process of rebuilding trust between American soldiers and their rifles would begin. Even before the Ichord Committee finished its final report, the Army had already begun quietly implementing reforms. The evidence from the field was too overwhelming to ignore. The weapon needed to be fixed, fast. In early 1967, the Army reclassified and upgraded the rifle under a new designation, M16A1. This was more than a name change. It marked the birth of a weapon rebuilt from the inside out. Every flaw that had plagued soldiers in Vietnam was addressed through design, training, and doctrine. The most critical improvement came first: chrome plating. Every chamber and bore was electroplated with a thin layer of chromium, creating a smooth, corrosion-resistant surface that allowed fired cartridges to extract effortlessly. The process added cost and time, but it eliminated the worst failure mode: spent cases sticking in rough steel. Rifles that once seized up after a few bursts could now fire hundreds of rounds without issue. Next came a redesigned buffer system inside the rifle's stock. Engineers increased the weight and stiffness of the buffer springs to slow the weapon's cyclic rate back to around 750 to 850 rounds per minute, closer to Stoner's original specification. The reduced speed lessened wear, heat, and stress on the bolt and extractor, improving long-term reliability. The forward assist, once controversial, was also strengthened. Soldiers were trained to use it correctly, not to force a jammed bolt, but to seat around quietly during patrols or ambushes. Meanwhile, Colt tightened quality control to ensure that no defective parts left the factory. But perhaps the most revolutionary change wasn't mechanical, it was educational. The myth of the self-cleaning rifle was formally buried. The Army completely rewrote its technical manuals. Field Manual 23-9, the M16's guide, was overhauled to include clear, illustrated cleaning instructions, emphasizing that proper maintenance was a matter of survival. Soldiers were taught to strip, clean, and reassemble their rifles daily in the field. To drive the message home, the Army introduced comic book-style manuals, simplified visual guides that showed each step with bold drawings and arrows. Even troops with limited English proficiency could follow them. These small, waterproof booklets became as essential as ammunition.
Cleaning kits were now standard issue for every rifleman. Each one included a 3-piece aluminum cleaning rod, a bore brush, a chamber brush, pipe cleaners for the gas tube, patches, oil, and a small toothbrush-style tool for scrubbing the bolt carrier. Units were required to carry them in the field, and inspections became routine. Platoon sergeants treated dirty rifles as disciplinary offenses, on par with leaving a weapon unsecured. The final piece of the puzzle was ammunition. By 1970, a new propellant, WC-844, replaced the dirty-burning WC-846. It contained less calcium carbonate, drastically reducing fouling. Combined with chrome plating and disciplined cleaning, this change finally allowed the rifle to function as intended. The transformation was immediate. By late 1967 and into 1968, troops equipped with M16A1s began reporting reliability levels equal to, or better than, any weapon in the field. Extraction failures virtually disappeared. Soldiers who had once cursed the rifle now praised it. Surveys conducted by the Department of Defense in early 1968 told the story clearly. Over 85% of soldiers said their M16A1 performed well in combat. Fewer than 2% wanted to replace it with another weapon. Jam rates had dropped to near zero under proper maintenance. In a single year, the M16's reputation flipped from death trap to dependable companion. The same design that had once failed spectacularly now excelled.
not because it had been reinvented, but because it had finally been built, trained, and maintained the way it should have been from the start. The men who fought through the worst of 1966 and 1967 paid for those lessons in blood. But thanks to their outcry, the rifle that replaced the flawed M16, the M16A1, became one of the most reliable and effective infantry weapons of the modern era.
By the end of the Vietnam War, the M16 story had come full circle. The rifle that once symbolized bureaucratic failure had evolved into one of the most trusted weapons in American hands. Yet beneath that redemption lay a deeper legacy, one that would permanently reshape how the U.S. military designed, tested, and approved its weapons. The Ichord Committee's investigation didn't just fix a rifle, it rewired the entire defense procurement system. Before the M16 scandal, decisions about weapon design and testing were largely internal, handled by military ordnance boards and defense contractors, far from public scrutiny. Congress approved funding but rarely questioned how the weapons themselves performed. Vietnam changed that forever. The M16 hearings established a new principle: transparency saves lives. Congressional oversight of weapons programs became routine. Every new system, from rifles to tanks to aircraft, would now face intense examination from multiple branches of government, with public hearings and soldier testimonies forming part of the process. Equally transformative was the recognition that soldiers in combat are the ultimate test engineers. Before Vietnam, weapons were evaluated in laboratories and firing ranges under controlled conditions. The M16 crisis proved that real-world combat revealed flaws no amount of technical modeling could predict. As a result, the military created new channels for field feedback, allowing soldiers to report malfunctions directly through what became the Product Quality Deficiency Report System. These reports could now trigger engineering changes or procurement reviews within weeks, not years. The principle of operational testing, requiring that new weapons be proven in realistic combat conditions before mass deployment, became mandatory. No longer could a system be fielded based solely on lab results and optimistic memos. Troops in the field had earned the right to be heard and believed. The scandal also redefined the concept of quality control. Inspectors were given the authority to reject defective weapons, even if that meant delaying production. The practice of overriding rejections to meet quotas, common during the rush to equip troops in 1965 and 1966, was banned. Cost savings could no longer justify lives lost. Most importantly, the M16 debacle taught an enduring truth. A weapon is not just a piece of hardware, it is a complete system, a marriage of design, ammunition, maintenance, and training. Alter one element without understanding the whole, and soldiers will pay the price. 2 decades later, when veterans of Ia Drang and later battles gathered for reunions, they reflected on that hard-won transformation. Among them was Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, who had served from 1967 to 1968, the worst period of the crisis. He recalled, "The early M16 was a death trap. We knew it. We reported it. Nothing happened for a year. Men died while people argued over powder specs and plating costs, but once they fixed it, once the A1 came out, it was the best rifle I ever carried. Light, accurate, reliable. It was what the original should have been. From tragedy came reform. The lessons learned through the M16's painful evolution guided every major weapons program that followed, from the M1 Abrams tank to the F-16 fighter jet. Oversight, testing, and soldier feedback became cornerstones of American defense acquisition. By the 1980s, the M16 had evolved through multiple generations, the M16A2, A3, and A4, and eventually into the compact M4 carbine, carried by soldiers well into the 21st century. What had begun as a cautionary tale became one of the most successful small arms families in history. But redemption came at a cost. No statistic can measure how many American soldiers died in 1966 and 1967 because their rifles jammed in combat. Each of those losses was preventable, the direct result of human error, institutional arrogance, and misplaced priorities. The M16's true legacy, then, is not the rifle itself, but the lesson it taught. Reliability cannot be assumed, oversight cannot be optional, and the voice of the soldier in the field must never be ignored. In the end, the rifle that once failed its users became the weapon that redefined how America protects them. The M16 failed American soldiers in Vietnam, and in doing so, forced the nation to build a system that would never let it happen again.